Welcome, Professor Anthony, to the Near East by Midwest podcast with the NISA department here at The Ohio State University. We're delighted to be joined by you today. Professor Anthony is a faculty member with the NISA department here at OSU, and he's a philologist and historian of late antiquity and early Islam, and his research primarily focuses on early Arabic literature, particularly the formation of the Islamic canonical literatures, the Quran and the Hadith. His scholarship covers a range of topics, from his monograph on crucifixion in early Islam, Umayyad crucifixion in its late antique context, and his book on the figure of the Prophet Muhammad in early historiography titled Muhammad and the Empires of Faith, as well as his translation and edition of one of the earliest biographies that we have of the Prophet Muhammad, that of Ma'mar ibn Rashid. So his current scholarship continues to push the field, which he very generously shares on his academia page. And he's also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the International Quranic Studies Association. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Listening to that always makes me feel like exhausted. It sounds like so much work.
Well, I mean, that was a selection, so there could have been more. I want to start. So you're an Ohioan yourself, from the infamous Springfield, Ohio.
Infamous.
But I also know that you did your master's in Cairo, Egypt, and you also traveled across the Levant. What took you from the heart of the Midwest to the Middle East?
Basically the similar things that one experiences usually when you do your undergrad, you have an idea of what you think you want to do with life. That transforms, you get sidelined, and you kind of get open to doing radical things. And for me, that radical thing, after doing a short study abroad in Egypt, was to actually go and do a master's degree at the American University in Cairo, to get my Arabic up, to get my knowledge of the Middle East up, and with the aim eventually of doing some sort of grad work and becoming a historian, a scholar of Middle Eastern history, Arabic, anything like that. Was kind of very open to multiple topics and specialties at that moment. But yeah, it was the sense of adventure and wanting to do something radical and different, and being bored with where I had grown up, and wanting to explore the world. It seemed like it was an ideal time to do it too. It was the 90s, some of us that lived through it still have the dream of the 90s in our hearts. We're going to see it revive. But yeah, it was just trying to do something different and adventurous, I think. Yeah.
I see. And I guess it was history from there, you knew.
Yeah. I mean, there's always the appeal of the region, right? So when you think about where you're going to go, do a study abroad or something, where you want to go, if you want to leave your country or whatever. When I went to the Middle East, first time, I think it was 1998, I think, it was between that and going to Russia. And the way that I decided to do it is that if I go to Russia, I'll probably only be able to be in Russia because it's so big. But if I go and I do it in the Middle East, or if I go to Cairo, then I could probably go to a bunch of different countries and get a bunch more passport stamps. And I think that sort of little tiny Boy Scout badge collecting mentality was what led me to go to the Middle East, because once I was done with my first study abroad in Cairo, I went to Jordan, Syria, and then Turkey and Istanbul, and never really looked back. So, yeah.
Fantastic. And so, I mean, there's a lot of topics to study in Islamic history.
Yeah.
What compelled you to go to the point of origin and focus on early Islam?
Yeah, it's probably my own interest in the Bible, biblical literature. I think this, for a lot of people, that's the appeal of the Middle East in some ways. Oh, it's the place where all this stuff comes from, and sort of the way that it kind of captures the imagination, and also intersects with a lot of the big questions of philosophy, religion, belief, everything. And wondering whether or not you can subject those texts and those questions to that rigorous scholarly historical scrutiny. And when you look at biblical studies and biblical scholarship, you're like, well, that's been done like many, many times, and by a lot of people. The resources are huge. When you looked at Quranic studies at the time, I think this is changing now, but it looked like it was a field that not a lot of people had worked on. There was still a lot of work to do, and there definitely is. It kind of reminds me of this old parable of Jesus that you find in the Gospels. The harvest is great, but the workers are few. A lot of things there, you felt like, oh, you could really do something new. You could really be maybe the first person to do something in the Western Academy, whereas it felt like other fields, like be it classics or biblical studies or New Testament studies or what, you name it, felt like it was just retreading and doing the same things over and over again. That's not true and that's not fair. And there's tons of new things to do in those fields. But that was my impression at the time. I think that was a large part of the pool. And then when you do something, sometimes you figure out that you're good at something, right? I found out that my core skill in life was the footnote, handcrafted artisanal footnotes. And you found out that you're good at footnoting, so you go into a field that allows you to footnote the bejesus out of things. And so that's sort of like the one thing leads to another. Once you find out that you're kind of good at something, you do it, and then you try to become better, and you're just caught up in the momentum of it all, I think.
Gotcha. And I mean, you bring up a really important point. One might argue that, the origins of Islam have been exhausted because we've known that for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that? What tools do we have today that we perhaps didn't
Yeah.
have in the past? And also methodologically, what is distinct about the project that's sort of, I guess you could say, booming in the academy right now?
Mm. Um, yeah, there it is the sort of thing, like, if you wanna know about it, you can just read the books, you can read the stories, you can know, down to the details of, what the prophet ate, how he put his shoes on, how he put his pants on. I know the names of all of his companions, they number in the hundreds. And you go into, like, extreme amounts of granular detail on the face of it, if you kind of accept the tradition at its word. And even if you don't accept the tradition at its word, there's a lot of material that theoretically you can sift through and weigh to be more reliable or less reliable and things like that. Um, but I think that one of the things that the modern practice of the academy has ingrained in it is trying to think about how can we look again or re-understand things if we question the assumptions of any traditional model. This applies across all fields. So if it's the study of the New Testament, say what does the history of Christianity look like if we don't accept the authority of the apostolic tradition? What does the history of Judaism look like if we don't take for granted the authority of the rabbinic tradition? What's the history of Islam look like if we don't take for granted the history of the Sunni Islamic tradition or whatever, and its kind of canonized version, its canonized communal memory? Um, but to do something like that requires a different way of thinking about evidence, a different way of thinking about where you draw your data from. So you can never get rid of the tradition. That's a massive data set. Tradition is your friend, it's not your enemy. You learn massive amounts from it. But I think that what more modern methods do, more methods of the secular academy wants to do, is want to expand our source base. And we do that in multiple ways. One of the ways we do that is through the practice of archaeology, a distinctively modern practice of historical investigation. Another way that we do so is through comparative philology and the comparative study of languages and their literatures. So we don't tend to look at languages and literatures within inside kind of the silo of its tradition or within the bounds of the canons of their authority, but we take a more comparative approach. So this means reading maybe the Quran not merely in the context of its early exegetical reception as, say, Kufa in southern Iraq or in Medina in eastern Arabia, but what's it look like to look like at the Quran in light of the larger scope or the exegetical cultures of late antiquity? That is, people who read scripture, reimagine it, interpret it, and things like that. That goes beyond kind of more a Muslim context. And another thing that is important too is that I think is really important right now is a revival of interest in the materiality of text and of textual remains. And so this is this impetus that was on pause for maybe around about a century in Quranic studies, where um, people didn't think much about the earliest copies of the Quran, whether those be written on vellum, so animal skin, or papyrus, or on the rocks and things like that. And so I think a large part of what the task of those who are interested in the early textual history of the Quran is to say, um, we have texts and they are written on material remains. Those texts have meaning in and of themselves, but also those material remains, they have data as well. And what that data is and what that can tell us about the history of the text and its interpretation, whether we're talking about the instantiations of the Quran on official inscriptions that are put on buildings by rulers, graffiti that's scattered across the Arabian Peninsula by everyday people like you and me, or by scribes that are extremely careful and trying to kind of copy and preserve this text for generations to come. Um, I think that's where a lot of the more exciting stuff is happening. But there's other things too. But
No, very exciting. And I mean, you're going to be teaching a class on codicology this upcoming semester. And this brings me to a question about discernment. What about studying early Islam at a place like OSU is different than studying it in a seminary setting? And more specifically, in terms of language, traditionally Islamic studies departments, even in the academy, have been, you train in Arabic and then you pick Persian or Turkish.
Yeah.
While here, Islamic studies is in the NOC department, where although those languages are offered, uh, Syriac, Hebrew, these languages, as well as ancient North Arabian languages, like Safavidic, are also offered. Why is that important, and
Yeah.
what's the difference there?
So one of the ways that I was trained, and I think a way a lot of people were trained that were older than me, is I guess the way it to be your professionalization was about becoming fluent or familiar with the Islamic tradition, its literatures, and its history, more or less along the an Orientalist model that was less comparative. It was more like you're meant to be sort of a kind of a clearinghouse in the Western Academy for that tradition, and also to represent it, because there wasn't many members of that tradition in the academy. I think that's changed a lot. So to give you an example of how that would work, usually you would pick one of the big three trinity of Islamic eight languages to specialize in. So that would be Arabic, Persian, Turkish, right? You pick your lane, more or less, that you're going to be the master disaster of, and then you choose a subspecialty. So you're an Arabist, so you do Persian, maybe you get some Turkish too, if you're very intrepid. The extremely intrepid, of course, do much more than that. Um, but what was not common is to do kind of a cross slice, a regional cross slice. It was uncommon for people that were, say, interested in the early history of Islam. Okay, you get your Arabic and you know, theoretically have good linguistic facility in it and its literature. And maybe the next language you're going to learn is rather Greek. Maybe you learn instead, Syriac or whatever. That's still rare, and part of the reason is because languages like Arabic and Greek are full-time jobs. They're very difficult, and they have a very large literature, and the philological tradition, grammatical tradition, lexicographical tradition behind them, very sophisticated. Um, and so it seems it's a bit much to ask a graduate student to do something like that. But I think one of the things that's happened and began to happen when I was a grad student, and it goes way back. It has early signs in the early 20th century too, I think, um, is this idea of late antiquity, this kind of the post-Roman world in the Near East, the post-Sassanid world, and what led to that. What were the currents that kind of culminated in that, and then eventually get the rise of Islam that kind of ushers in this this transition phase that takes us from antiquity into what's the early medieval world. Um, so thinking about it in those terms, I think has reconfigured what we're doing. Like we're no longer thinking about, oh, how do I serve as an ambassador to a tradition that maybe I'm a part of, maybe I'm not, but I'm very sympathetic towards, and I'm very interested in educating people into. Um, how do I think about sort of a broader kind of global phenomenon that tradition is a part of, but that's not kind of the main thing. Maybe we're thinking regionally, maybe we're thinking chronologically, and we have to deal with kind of a multitude and plurality of traditions that all kind of give us different perspectives on all those phenomena. And I think that's
Mhm.
one of the main transformations. Um, I think what's enabled that, to be perfectly honest, is the diversification of our field, because we have um, many people that are interested in it, from both abilities, perspectives, specialties, and you don't feel like you have to be a one-man band or a one-woman band anymore. And so I think that's freed up, um, I think, some of the responsibilities that we feel, but also created new opportunities for the sorts of research avenues we're able to pursue.
Gotcha. And I want to sort of dig a little bit deeper. There have been two sort of camps that have emerged, um, both across the academy, perhaps, but in interaction with um, the Muslim community itself, where the revisionists and the traditionalists almost seem like sects.
No.
And I'm sure that you've been put in on both sides of the spectrum by
Yeah.
different groups at different times.
Yeah.
But there are revisionists, say, who put you more towards the traditionalist side because you do accept the general outline,
Yeah.
timeline of the prophet's life, as well as the traditional timing for the codification
Yeah.
of the Quran. Now, if two people are working with the exact same sources, presumably, but reach radically different conclusions, then one can assume that the difference is methodology. So I want to ask, could you, I guess, take us into the historian's workshop and sort of explain what is your threshold of evidence when it comes to assessing and interrogating sources, and what sort of evidence, quality of evidence, would it take for you to accept some of the claims that are made by revisionists who want to put, um, you know, the Quran in, say, the Levant,
Yeah.
or,
Yeah.
push against the traditionalist
Yeah.
timeline?
It's a lot there. You know, one, I would say early in my career, I might have a much more open mind about all that stuff because I felt like I didn't have as much of a handle on the evidence that I think I have now. Um, for like the most radical thesis, like the Quran came from the Levant or something like that. Um, I would probably require the discovery of something like, well, I think one of two things would really tip the scales for me. Something like an early manuscript of a proto-Quran, which I don't think is out there, and it's provenance from the Levant. But the other thing that would radically transform my view, my current kind of model, would be if we found pre-Islamic documents written in Arabic of a religious nature. That would be, it wouldn't have to be like Proto-Quran or whatever. But if we did find, like, I don't know, whether it would be like a sermon, it would be a poem, it would be maybe a translation of like the gospel or something like that, that was verifiably pre-Islamic, that would give me pause, perhaps. But I think one of the things I guess I could say is about methodology is I think methodologies have to be understood primarily in terms of their goals. So the rules of any sort of method um, are usually should serve um, the goal that is trying to attain. I think one of the major differences between, like, say, seminary and more secular academy is what are the goals. I think that in a seminary context, the goal is to make good Muslims. It is to perhaps to train leaders to have an important pastoral leadership role within that community. And that requires um, mastering and knowing well a certain corpus in order to give them legitimacy within their community, but also to equip them to face whatever challenges that arises. I think that's a pretty large goal that I have zero interest in, and it would be terrified if I had that responsibility. I'm more or less trying to teach people, like, it's a joke that's said often about academics, but have to admit it's true. Academics are mostly good at teaching you how to be an academic, right? So I, I want to create good scholars, good historians, people that are good at language. You can really only give what you have. I'm not a good Muslim, so I can't give someone a good Islam or a good way of being Muslim. Hopefully, I can give them a good way of being a historian, good reader of text, and things like that. And when I think about my method, what I want to achieve is I want to avoid, on the one hand, historical error, and I want to attain a very textured and accurate as possible understanding of the past and the people who inhabited it and their mindsets, and how their interactions with one another kind of transformed their societies and their thoughts and their cultures. And when I'm lucky, maybe get some insight of how that echoes down till today. And most of my methods are trying um, to get that in a rigorous way. I'm not trying to uncover kind of a deeper metaphysical truth, except perhaps the conviction that the past is knowable to different degrees and that we can know about our fellow human beings. There is that miracle of I can read a text that's over 2,000 years old or even older, or written 1,000 years ago, and I can feel like a kinship with them, or I feel like I can understand them despite boundaries of um, geography, language, culture. We still have this kind of convergence of horizons.
Yeah. You bring up a really interesting point. A lot of times people use the word or the term historical memory,
Yeah,
and I know that
yeah,
you've, voiced certain reservations when it
yeah,
comes to that term. Could you break that down a little bit? Why is that problematic,
yeah,
from a historian's
yeah.
perspective?
Well, I like historical memory. I think every historian likes historical memory, but it's also the type of thing that we tend to rely upon when we know we've kind of admitted a bit of defeat, in as much as we think, oh, we don't have the type of evidence that would enable us to answer certain types of questions, right? Um, and I think that many people have a mistake when they think about historical events or things that happen. They maybe have a strong desire to moralize the past and events that happened, particularly at certain moments of a political contestation where people are fighting over how to understand the past. Um, so, to give you an example, there are some things that we can audit in history, and I think we know very well because a sufficient amount of evidence survives, and we can know that question very well, and that probably will weigh heavily on us, or it will inspire us. So, for example, like we have a pretty damn good idea of the level of horror that was involved in the transatlantic slave trade. There's massive amounts of evidence for that, and the data for that is clear, and it haunts us even today, even the thoughts of it. But if you take, for example, say I wanted to know, well, what was the scale of death and carnage or whatever of either the slave trade in my era or the conquest of, say, the Persians or the Romans or the Arabs or whatever, we will never have that amount of data. So it's ultimately beyond kind of our knowledge in a certain sense. We won't know the numbers, we won't know the names and things like that. Um, but what we can know is how people remembered and interpreted that past, right? So one of my favorite kind of historian come philosophers, because he's very interesting in talking about society, is this guy by the name of Al-Amiri, and he writes a history, or not a history really, it's a philosophical treatment of why Islam's so great. And he's a Persian, but he's a Muslim, and he's many generations removed. And he thinks that the Islamic conquests were great, right? And he makes this really interesting argument about why they were great and why he's happy that they happened. And what he does is he describes Islam as bringing a different type of governance that he preferred to the Persian governance beforehand, and a different way of, you know, organizing and conceptualizing society that he attributes to pre-Islamic Persia and to his current era. And there's a lot of things that he mentions that I think we would be very, at least Americans would be, you know, very sympathetic with. So one of the things that he mentions, for instance, is he considered Persia to be overly hierarchical to the extent that he thought it was more or less like a caste society. And he thought that when Islam came, it had a more egalitarian vision, egalitarian, at least among Muslims. And he thought this created and opened up a possibility for social egalitarianism and for an idea of kind of morality that transcended class that did not previously exist in Persia. And so he kind of is very much in favor of that. Um, and so all that is to say, is he right? Is he wrong? Did he misrepresent pre-Islamic Persia? Does he give an overly rosy picture, a triumphalist, Whiggish vision of Islamic history? Um, for some historians, would be like, no, we don't. Who knows? Like, who knows if he did or not? What's interesting is let's study his historical memory, how he constructed the memory of the past, how he constructed his memory of Persia. So it becomes this history of mentalities, right? And where I get a bit reluctant or want to push against this is sometimes I think it's an easy way to throw in the towel, because there's certain moments where maybe we can know more than we are giving ourselves credit for. Is that we accept that it's going to require a big heavy lift. Going to require to, like, we're going to have to maybe do a huge epigraphic survey. Maybe we're going to have to do a lot more we're going to have to do a lot more archaeology. Maybe we're going to have to edit a lot more text and do a lot more kind of broader reading than we've done. And this is not to say that I think that people study historical memory are lazy by any means, but I do think that it has a way sometimes in the way that people write to give up too easily on difficult historiographical questions. So that's why I think sometimes I want to push back against it.
I see. And I mean, it's fascinating to hear it in the context of the Islamic conquests
Yeah.
or the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah.
Uh, but to bring it a bit closer to home, how did you navigate that when dealing with the Prophet's life
Yeah.
and the historiographical materials,
Mhm.
determining, what to take at face value,
Yeah.
what to interrogate a little bit
Yeah.
more,
Yeah.
uh, in order to go about the project of reconstructing
Yeah.
his life?
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's a totally different task. You're right. Part of the ways that I try to do that is to broaden the source base that is available. Um, so for one, you can know a lot about a person's life just on the basis of the material reality that they're born into, the material, the kind of, what is the economy of their society, what is the landscape where they live, what are the cultures and customs and religious beliefs of the societies that they are born into. You can know quite a bit about them from that, and we can determine these things from things like archaeology, from epigraphy, and so on and so forth. And there are, of course, always gaps. Um, some, Arabia is always it's a darker corner of the world of late antiquity, but it's not totally without light, right? Um, and the other thing I think, is something that's happened recently in the field is a reevaluation of the Quran. We now, I think, have definitively excluded the possibility that the Quran is a late product, that it's a product of, say, like the second century, or even the product of an editorial work of the second Islamic century, that would be the 800s. And I do think it's a very early text, codified very early on. And so for me, it's the primeval document about early Muslim religiosity, but also what the message of the Prophet Muhammad was. Um, and I think the Quran as a source has especially been undersold as a source for getting the basic outlines of what the Prophet Muhammad's life was like. Like the fact that it has a hinge moment where you have a time where he's in an environment that is very adversarial to him and where he's beleaguered. And he undertakes something where he leaves that arena and enters another where he finds himself as um, basically as a ruler who's building a polity and things like that. That's very clear. Some of the major battles and their successes, more often than their failures, but mostly their successes, are very visible, I think, in many chapters of the Quran. And also aspects of his personal life, his interactions with his wives and his family, and also his interactions with his followers and the questions they bring to him. That's all there. And I think that it's pretty raw in terms of material. It's edited and it's arranged and put in kind of an orderly fashion, um, at least by 650 by my reckoning. But and that's more or less the traditional view too. I find it convincing. Um, and then we have this later material that begins to be written that gives these narrative presentations of his life. And that is historical memory to me. That is an attempt to create a literary account of the significance not just of his life, but of his ummah, and also how they fit into like this grand scape of God's providential plan for history, beginning with the creation of Adam to ultimately the day of judgment. And they sit at the middle, at the climax of history, right, at the crux of it. Basically is the most important guy and the most important people that were following him. And this transforms the world. So you have to understand what are the factors that create the need for writing down this historical memory, to recording this historical memory. Another way of understanding it is to create epic literature about the Prophet Muhammad. And you also have to understand how it survives, how it reaches us, and the challenges for interpreting it and things like that. Um, but I also think, even though it is of a highly literary quality, um, it was not just popped out of somebody's head. It was produced by a social context, and it was produced by scholars that were, in some sense, not just writing a story, but also trying to represent reality as well, and represent the past as they understood it as being accessible to them. So there are very I think to modern historians, I think maybe just about anybody, very tantalizing aspects of that corpus where you like say, well, maybe there's really early materials in this corpus. Maybe it preserves very early treaties. Maybe it preserves very early administrative documents that can give us a broader understanding and a higher resolution view of like who the Prophet Muhammad was.
Hmm. You mentioned the term ummah.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, you recently came out with an article
Mhm.
that challenges the idea that the community termed ummah
Mhm.
was a purely religious
Yeah.
community that originated through the movement of the Prophet
Yeah.
Muhammad. Could you sort of describe what alternative thesis you present and what materials led you to that conclusion?
Yeah. Um, so there was recently, I think, a real big push to question when this the big fancy word that is used is ethnogenesis. So when do a people kind of come into existence? When do they have a sense of like, oh, we're a people, we have an identity, we have a culture, and we're self-conscious, and we want to kind of pass that identity on to people. So to future generations. And so one of the major questions that historians are interested in that work in late antiquity is, when did ethnogenesis occur for this people, that people, that people? When could we visibly see that people considered themselves to be Germans or French or whatever, you name it? Usually not so closely tied to national identities, but and we can do the same thing with Arabs. We can do the same thing with Greeks and Egyptians and so on and so forth. And recent scholarship, I think has come to, I think, a consensus that I think has lost its shelf life, that I tried to contribute to overturning, and that is that Arab identity is a byproduct primarily of the post-conquest era, right? That Arabs really didn't consider themselves as Arabs or have an Arab identity until the Islamic conquest happened. Then it very slowly began to coalesce, or maybe swiftly, depending on your perspective. And one of the easy ways that you can see this emerge in the literature is whether or not how you refer to the conquest themselves. Like, that is, what is the adjective that you put next to, like, the conquest? Are they the Arab conquest, or are they the Islamic conquest? Things like that. So, um, I'm still working through a lot of those issues, but one of the things that got a bit annoying to me, or at least I felt a bit um, like that was ripe for a need of intervention, is the way that ummah is translated often in our literature, but the academic literature, um, as religious community. And I didn't really feel like that really did justice to how the word ummah was used in the Quran. And the main observation that kind of led me to that was the fact that the Quran, especially in the Meccan surahs, really speaks of Muhammad as being sent to an ummah, not creating an ummah from scratch. And so that's very fascinating. So an ummah basically just means a nation or a people. I think a people would probably be the most generic kind of term. It can just refer to a group of just about anything, actually, when you get down to brass tacks. Um, but he was sent to a people, right? And he was sent to a people, that kind of raises the question, well, who was that people? Who were they, all right? And you could be very modest about it. You could say his people were the Meccans. You could say his people were his tribe, Quraysh, right? You could say his people were the folks that lived in Hijaz in Western Arabia. But eventually, what you, I think, have to conclude, unless you're super parsimonious, and some people would prefer to be very parsimonious about this, um, the ummah is said to be an Arabic-speaking ummah, and to me, that is the Arabs. Like, he's sent to the Arabic speakers, and that's the Arabs. And I see him as someone that is sent to the Arabs to kind of instruct them and to transform them into a different sort of people, a new sort of people. And so this is not to say that the Quran is only for the Arabs, or anything like that, or the Ummah only included the Arabs. Even Arab identity itself and tribal identity is not like a racial identity. You can become a member of an Arab tribe. And tribes can kind of get together in confederations and things like that. But what I relied upon, actually, to really suss out what happens as over the course of Muhammad's career, was this early idea I encountered in the medieval exegetical literature, and it has, I think, precursors in much earlier literature. And that is that really Muhammad has two sorts of ummahs. They're kind of the same, but they're more or less two different ones. One is the ummah da'wah, or the ummah that receives the summons, the initial summonings of the Prophet Muhammad. And the other one is what they called ummat al-ijaba, or the ummah that the answers, the ummah that responds to the summons. And so the way that I conceptualize that is the Prophet Muhammad was meant to kind of transform his people into a people that were given a divine mission, and which he mediated through his instruction and through his teachings, which is in the Quran. And he eventually, through those instructions and teachings, bequeaths to them a sort of a special mission as an elected people that are transformed by the Quran to achieve kind of God's providential purposes in human history. And by all accounts, they more or less did. But this is a model that we find repeated in many cases throughout late antiquity. The Franks are a great kind of parallel example, where you have this notion of the Romans as a people, and the Romans as a state, they begin to collapse. They show vulnerability, and their empire doesn't seem as impervious or eternal as it once seemed. And some peoples from the frontiers kind of take over the project in some way. Some of them want to use their people. Some of the leaders want to use their people to restore the Roman name, and some want to have their peoples replace the Romans in many ways. And this is, to me, what happens with the Arabs. I mean, the Arabs, they become the new prestige people. The Roman, Romanitas, or being Roman, becomes less important than being Arab or being Muslim. And this is one of the grand kind of transformations of Islam. I think it's one of the things that makes it such a powerful force. As powerful as Hellenism, as powerful as Christianity.
Mm. Since we're on the topic, because you mentioned that what sort of fueled this question was understanding how it's used in the Quran.
Yeah.
I want to jump to another article that you wrote that challenges the idea that the Quran's account of the death of Jesus is in response or in dialogue with Christian heresiology, but rather that it's in response to Jewish polemical traditions that told at Yeshua.
Yeah.
Could you sort of set the scene of a late antique Arabia in which these ideas are circulating, they're sort of in the water, such that the Quran would respond to them?
Yeah.
And what exactly was the contention there? And
Yeah.
more broadly, what are the debates that are being had
Yeah.
in this milieu?
Yeah. I think one of the questions that the Quran raises, because it's not like you can imagine if the Quran happened, or the Quran emerged in like Mayan civilization or something like that. Like it's connected to the late antique world, right? It's not as if Europeans came to the Americas and they found a Quran or a scripture that the Mayans had, and it mentioned people like Jesus and John the Baptist or whatever, and like, oh, holy cow, how is this possible? Arabia was part of the late antique world. Parts of Arabia were under the Sassanids, the Persians. Parts of Arabia were under the Romans. Parts of Arabia were under the Axumites. Part of it was entirely independent. But the key thing to know about all of these neighboring societies is they were societies in which various groups that interacted with, drew from, and had a high regard for scripture, particularly the Bible, were ascendant and for the most part regnant. And some of these communities had representatives, some large, some small, throughout the Arabian Peninsula. We don't have a census, so it's again one of those historical questions where I would love to know what the exact religious breakdown was, but we don't really have that sort of evidence. What we do know is that the Quran talks frequently about biblical figures. And what part of the more interesting work I think that needs and remains to be done and is being done is to do an audit of the motifs associated with each of the biblical figures that appear in the Quran, and how those motifs appear or do not appear in the literature of the Quran's neighbors, essentially. Oftentimes that process of auditing and asking that question is misunderstood, as if we imagine that in Western Arabia it had like the Library of Alexandria of late antique literature. What we're really looking for is wondering whether or not when the Quran mentions something, discusses a story, or has a motif within it, whether or not the Quran's enunciation of that motif is unprecedented, or whether or not it has been precedented. And insofar as we don't have a complete record of all the things and all the words that were ever said in late antiquity, or even all the literature, we try to do is kind of a broad audit as we can in Syriac, Hebrew, Coptic, Latin, Greek. Doesn't mean that we think Muhammad read any of those languages or even that Arabians did. So when it comes down to the life of Jesus, there's a very interesting thing that the Quran seems to say about the life of Jesus. In other words, that he wasn't crucified. But it doesn't just say that he wasn't crucified, at least it seems it says that. it says that it only appeared to them, so that is, whomever Jesus's contemporaries were. And it's been very difficult to sort of suss out what the Quran's responding to, why the Quran would make that claim. I think the thing that most people think is that the Quran gets most of its information about Jesus through Christians, and that most of its information is mediated through the fourfold gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I don't think that's the case. And what I was trying to show is that the Quran's foil for talking about Jesus is especially the end of his life, but others like Holder Zillington have even tried to expand it farther into his miracles, are not responding to Christian stories about Jesus as much as as it's responding to Jewish stories about Jesus. And we argue that this makes a lot more sense, and the Toledat Yeshu is one of these, um, because most of these verses and most of the discussion of Jesus, there's one exception to this, the 19th surah of the Quran, um, emerges in a Medinan context, which the tradition and most historians believe was had a very large Jewish component. Like Jews and Jewish scholars were part of that milieu. And so if they're very likely to interact with anyone, they're very likely to interact with the Jews of Medina and their views of scripture and the biblical past and so on and so forth. And so what the Toledat Yeshu is you can't call it a single text. It's a kind of an oral complex that survives in many different iterations as different sorts of texts. I know it's kind of, it sounds silly to say it, but one of the ways I would explain it or explore it is that we all know, for example, what Uncle Ben says to Spider-Man before he dies, right? He's like, with great power comes great responsibility. There is not one single canonical Spider-Man text. Some people encounter it first through a movie. Some people encounter it through a reboot of the Marvel universe. Some people encounter it to like the original, is it Jack Kirby? I don't know. I think Jack Kirby did it, version or whatever. As a matter of fact, I don't really even know who the first person to really write those words were, but what I know is that's part of the Spider-Man story. And if you ever retell the story, you either have to put that in there or make a conscious decision not to put it in there. So each of the versions of Toledat Yeshu works like that. They have motifs, they have scenes, they have ideas that are very clearly enunciated. And what the Toledat Yeshu is a Jewish parody, a non-rabbinic Jewish parody of the life of Jesus. And it tells the story of sort of a wayward student and his embrace of magic, and how eventually he's hunted down and killed by rabbinic authorities with the help of the Romans in order to put a stop to his mischief, right? Not just him, but also John the Baptist, his followers, and things like that. And it survives in numerous languages. Probably the earliest ones are written in Aramaic. And what's striking about it in that story is you have an account of the crucifixion of Jesus, very different from what you find in the Gospels. And in the accounts of the crucifixion of Jesus, there's a dispute between Jesus' opponents and Jesus' followers about whether or not Jesus was really crucified and died. Jesus' followers claim that no, rather he was taken up, he was ascended to heaven, like Jesus prophesied he would be. And the Jewish scholars say, no, he really is dead. And there's an account about what happened to his body. And eventually his body is produced and his Jewish adversaries come out on the winning end. But it seems, when you read that story, to me at least, what I argue is that most of the motifs that you find in the Quran and the Quranic treatment of Jesus' death match far more closely the accounts in the earliest preserved versions of that Jewish anti-gospel, that parody of Jesus's life, than anything that you really find in the Gospels. And of course, the Gospels do play a role. This Jewish anti-gospel, is drawing from the 4 canonical Gospels. There's many instances where you can see that it is, and it's purposely trying to parody these accounts. And so my argument is, if you look at the Quranic portrait of Jesus as responding to Jewish claims about Jesus and Jewish stories about Jesus, rather than trying to say, respond directly to the gospel accounts, any one of them, it transforms your understanding of what the Quran's doing with, and how the Quranic Jesus took the shape that we find it in the Quran.
That's really fascinating. Um, I want to ask about one more of your articles, which you discuss two. You call them lost surahs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, these were two texts that were included in the Codex of Ubay ibn Ka'b, but excluded in the Codex of Uthman ibn Affan, who is credited with standardizing the Quranic text. He was the third caliph. Could you, I mean, to some, the title might come across as provocative
Yeah.
and perhaps suggest that there's something in these texts that's scandalous. What exactly do these texts contain, and what role did they play in early Islamic religiosity?
Yeah.
And what conclusion did you reach by the end?
Mm-hmm. So what these two texts are, they're extremely short. They're two prayers, basically. So they're much more similar to like the last chapters of the Quran, the first. So Fatiha and Mu'awwidhatayn, right? They're very similar to that. And I would say many Muslims might know it through like praying the Witr prayer and things like this. So they're a part of Muslim ritual life. And so what the article does, first and foremost, is it tries to show that early Muslims did consider it to be a surah, and that's the key word that I want to use. And it's interesting because not a lot of things are called surah. So a chapter of the Quran is what you assume that means. And that these surahs had not a role to play in the written, canonized Ottoman Quran as it survives today, the Ottoman text type. But it does have they are canonized in a sense, and they do become a part of Muslim religiosity through ritual. And what the main point of the article eventually became, and what it got me thinking about quite a bit actually, was the two ways that the Quranic text becomes codified. So it becomes codified through its materiality, what you decide to write down and put between the two covers. And also it becomes codified through ritual and liturgical performance as well, right? So the main models of how many surahs are going to be in the Quran are usually 3. Uthman is the one that wins the day. Ubay has, I would say, the maximalist understanding. So he includes all of the surahs that's in in the Uthmanic Codex, but he adds these 2 more as part of his surah, ostensibly. And you have the minimalist, which I would say would be Ibn Mas'ud, who allegedly excluded 3 surahs that, again, very short, they're prayers, essentially, surahs that currently are in Ottoman's Codex. But all of these surahs were, for all 3 figures, part of the kind of ritual canon of kind of received prayers, liturgy, performance of kind of Muslim religiosity. And so what I was really interested in is exploring is the way that these marginal cases, these surahs that are really prayers, kind of show us how you have 2 different types of canonization that happens in the early Islamic period, and 2 different ways of mechanisms of enforcing that canonization. So one of the ways of enforcing that canonization is making a book, right? The other way of enforcing canonization is through communal prayer, so the Jumu'ah prayer, essentially, and also one's personal prayer or whatever. So you have to recite portions and sometimes entire chapters from the Quran when you conduct your daily prayers, and also when you do the communal prayers. And that's another way in which you can canonize things. I mean, I don't mention this in the paper, but theoretically, and this was pondered by some early jurists of the Hanafi branch of Islamic law, you could say, well, you know, Jesus is a prophet, and he was given a scripture. Can we recite the Lord's Prayer in, in our prayer? Is that okay? Can we ritually canonize that? Or even in not the Lord's Prayer, can we recite, say, selections from Torah? Can we recite like a Psalm of David as a part of it? Does it always have to be the Quran of Muhammad and things like that? And according to some of these really Hanafi texts, this was pondered. If you didn't have enough of the Quran memorized, or as like a I always forget the English of this. Ruqsa. It's like an allowance. What is a good word for it? But yeah, you know, you get a license to do it for a time until your Arabic is straightened out, or until you've memorized it, or something like this. And you know for a fact there's only certain things that you can recite as part of the kind of the ritual canon, right? So I was really interested in that kind of dual process, but also I wanted to see how well these two surahs of Ubay were preserved, because the previous Western scholarship had been like, oh, you can hardly find these. And then a lot more things have been published now, and we have a lot more text than we used to have. And so I tried to revisit that and show that it's actually really well documented, and it's really quite extensively discussed. And one of the things that stuck out to me consistently is how these surahs are consistently called surahs, and there's not really many other texts in the early material that I looked at least, and I would love to hear a counterexample. There is one that are called surahs. It seems to be a textual unit that is explicitly used to refer to parts of the Quran.
I see. Um, Thank you for walking us through that for those who just took the title and didn't actually read the article. There's a lot there. Um, is there anything that we should look forward to reading from you in
Everything.
everything? Well, yes. But yeah, is there any scholarship that is coming out soon that we can look forward to?
You know, you never know when stuff's going to come out. There's definitely stuff that has been written that is waiting to come out. So let me just think about. So I have an article where I argue about who the Sabaoun are, and I think I know who they are. And also have an article on the theme of creation in the Quran coming out. I have some stuff on early Islamic history, like Ali and his caliphate. I have an article coming out on that. I have two, actually. I have also one on his lands in Western Arabia, and his last deed and testament that he leaves to his family, which I think is authentic and that survives. And I have a translation that I need to write an introduction for. It's called Sirat Umar ibn Abdulaziz by an Egyptian scholar named Ibn Abd al-Hakam. It's the earliest biography that survives in Arabic of someone other than the Prophet. That's translated, re-edited. I need to send it out, be published. Um, and, you know, I'm working on a book. Hopefully my next book's going to be on the Quran. It's still in the very early stages. But I'm intensely interested in the process of canonization and material remains, how the Quran and its idiom shapes early Arabic epigraphy. I have a lot of things to say on that. And also, I'm very interested in the Sena palimpsest as a text. This is our earliest copy that survives of the Quran. So I have a lot of things to say about that too, but that's all in very early stage. So
Gotcha. Well, there's a lot to look forward to. Um, Besides publishing, you have a very active Twitter, where you post from politics to manuscripts to epigraphy to memes.
yeah.
Would you consider that public scholarship?
So the way that I treat it is like a messy desk. So if I read something, I find it interesting, I post it on there, especially because it gets what I'm really trying to do is subtly influence people other than me to work on certain topics and certain things that I find interesting. Um, as you get to a certain point in your career, I remember when I was really starting out as a grad student and you choose your dissertation and you wonder, you're like, "Oh my god, am I gonna ever have another idea again?" And, like, maybe not, I don't know, and you're kind of, like, terrified about and what happens eventually as you kinda mature and you progress is that you get way too many ideas and way so many ideas that you'll never be able to work on that you would like to work on and things like that. Uh, so usually the stuff that I post on there myself, either because I was grumpy and I skipped breakfast, or that's or it's because I'm just reading something, or I'm preparing for class, and I find it interesting. I want other people to find it interesting too, and you kind of just it's like my my message in a bottle that I'm throwing out into the ocean of Twitter or X or whatever it is. And yeah, people can receive it as they want.
I like that you called it a messy desk. It's a good description. Okay, one final question. For students here at OSU, what classes can they take with you?
They can take, I guess, a decent amount. You can take a course on Islamic conquest. I teach regularly philosophy. Well, what's it called?
Arabic.
Yeah, I think it's called Arabic. What is it? It's called Arabic philosophy and something or other. You took it. You should remember the title. Anyway, the title was crafted for general education. But I think it's philosophy and society in the classical Islamic world is what it is. And so that's my course on another thing that I'm very interested in, and that's the reception of Greek philosophy during the classical age and during the Abbasid period. We go beyond the Abbasid period too. Um, I strongly recommend that. I think that's a very fun class. And I regularly teach courses on the Quran, on Arabic literature. I have some new ones in the works as well. Um, but those are the two most reliable ones. Except for I can't believe I forgot. I have my Introduction to Islam recently redesigned for the general education curriculum, which is new. Um, is Traditions of Islam, and that provides just a general introduction to what does religious studies look like in the academy, what what is different about studying religion, say in a church, synagogue, and mosque versus in the context of a secular academic institution that's funded by state and taxpayer money. Thank you very much, taxpayers. Um, what's the difference and what's it all about? And then exposing students to the different streams of the traditions of Islam. This can be Islamic law, Islamic literature, Shiism, Sufism, Sunnism, you name it, that type of stuff. No.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today about your research, your methodology, the classes you teach. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.